could be said that this is kind of like my happy place because it's got art, and we're going to find out in a minute. I'm pretty sure they got beer in there. This is the occasion of the 150th anniversary of the birth of Edward Curtis. So yes, finally part 3 of this 3-part series on the Edward Curtis project called the North American Indian. 150 years. We're going to go in there and look at photogravures. And photogravure, that would be like French for photogravure. And 150 years, that's sesquicentennial. That's Latin for when you look at Roman numerals, I think. Let's go look at some gravures. Before we do that, we have to talk about pictorialism. Pictorialism. Let's talk pictorialism. The style of Edward Curtis, it has been said, is pictorial, and that he was part of the Pictorialism Movement. So pictorialism, I guess, is supposed to mean a style of photography in which is blurry and out of focus and over manipulated and foggy. That's the way I've always understood it, vaguely, never really paid attention to it. But upon further review, I'm here to say that today's experts in art and photography history have it all wrong. Now, there was a day when the curators of thought did have this right, back during the era of what we would consider the Pictorialism movement. But again, I'm going to say it again. Pictorialism in photography is not a style of photography. Now, this is fun. Here is audience participation time, in which you get to roll your eyes at me, just like I always do when I hear a public speaker say, according to the dictionary. We're going to the Oxford Dictionary, which should always be the first place we go when we want to define a word in the English language. So, according to the Oxford Dictionary, picture means painting or drawing. Back during the 1900 and prior, the word picture just simply had an elevated status compared to today. Our number 2 source is always good to go to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, and today they have added the word photograph to the word picture. And always, just to be on the safe side, a third source to double check the definition of an English word is the Urban Dictionary, just in case today's pop culture has some reference to a private body part and you don't want to embarrass yourself. Imagine, if you will, the word picture having a little more wow factor. It would be like saying, oh gracious, look at my new piece of jewelry. It's a 5-carat diamond on 24-karat gold. We must go to the gallery and look at the pictures. John Ruskin's article says they're phenomenal. So compare that to something today. Do you like my diamond? It's not a diamond, it's cubic zirconia. It's not even cubic zirconia. It's plastic made to look like cubic zirconia. OMG, did you see the pictures on my Instagram? Likewise, the word pictorial in the art world would also take on a slightly different meaning then than it would today, because back then it pretty much only referenced the arts. We did not have pictorial books about fire trucks or illustrative books about fire trucks because there was no such thing as that, really. So back then, in an art gallery, a pictorial artist would be differentiated from a decorative artist, one that makes paintings versus one that makes fine art cabinets. Along comes photography. The year is 1839. It is a splendid piece of technology. Middle-aged men going out and taking pictures. Ooh, no, because using the word picture back then would have been utterly scandalous. They took photos of their cows, which would be utterly acceptable. So we have this brand new magical device that duplicates things, and at the same time, we have these artists, these painters who were trained in the arts, and they pick up this gizmo and decide, hey, wait a minute, I can make art with this thing. Like I said earlier, it was scandalous because the photographer said, no, you can't, and those that were in the art community said, no, you can't. But quietly, they were making their art, and they called it pictorial photography. Rudolf Eichmeyer Jr. in January of 1898 from the camera note, "I have read somewhere that photographs are fatally easy to make." Indeed, yes, photographs are, but not pictures. That quote is from Camera Note, which is the official organ of the New York Camera Club. Probably should have consulted the Urban Dictionary on that first. Originality, hand in hand with simplicity, are the first two qualities which we Americans need in order to produce artistic pictures. These qualities can only be attained through cultivation and conscientious study of art in all of its forms. This is Alfred Stieglitz in 1892, A Plea for Art Photography in America. Now, bearing in mind that quote is from the year 1892, Alfred Stieglitz is a name we would put at the top of the list in terms of the pictorialism photography movement. I personally don't put him to the top. I don't think anyone should. And Stieglitz was all over the place with his opinion as he grew older. This is an article that appeared in Brush and Pencil in April of 1904 by Sadakichi Hartman. The qualification of a picture in order to find admission into a photo succession exhibition must be that it give evidence of personal artistic intention, irrespective of the methods employed, provided only they belong to photography. Sadakichi Hartman, what a freaking brilliant mind. He was an artist, he was a writer, he was a critic, he was a patron, he was a collector, and the funny thing is that he was a friend of Stieglitz, he was an enemy of Stieglitz, but I put him as a great authority on the subject of pictorialism. This is Horsley Hinton in the book Barnett Book of Photography from 1905. We use the term pictorial instead of artistic. First, because the latter has become so misappropriated as to have lost its proper significance. And secondly, because it evades useless controversy as to whether photography may be regarded as an art. I would consider Horsley Hinton at the top of the list of the most influential people in the pictorialism movement, especially when it comes to teaching the art in photography. What we can say is, right out the gate in the world of photography were two branches of photography. One would be art photography, the other being straight photography, or we could say pictorial photography and duplication photography. The exciting thing about this Edward Curtis exhibition at the Muskegon Museum of Art is that it is photography that is true art. Let's roam around the galleries here and select a few gravures, and we'll give Edward Curtis a critique and review in the general sense of both photography and art. But before we do that, we gotta find that beer. This is an art museum that has beer. Hi. You open a can of this and it smells like coffee. First up, we're going to look at an oasis in the Badlands, and then coincidentally right next to it is going to be Geronimo, and then over here Canyon de Chelly. So first off, over here, this is, I don't know why, it's just purely one of my favorites. It's a rare thing to get clouds like this from a camera in that era because of the technology of the chemistry. So anytime you can get a little bit of sky, you work it in post-processing, which Edward Curtis did with great success. In fact, it is so perfect. It is so, well, tastefully done first off, but a lot of effort went into it. He's got a lot going on here in terms of the story that he's telling. A common theme in these first three prints, I believe, is Edward Curtis suggesting the frail limitation of not merely the vanishing race, not merely humanity, but of all living creatures. The headdress, the white stallion, which in itself is a status symbol, and the alert posture suggest a commanding respect. Yet, here is this magnificent animal taking a break for a watering break. which I think balances out the whole story in terms of the frailty. Next, Geronimo. Geronimo, oh my gosh, what a rock star he was back in the era. This is an example of the superiority of looking at a print in a properly lit gallery versus a screen rendering on your mobile device. Curtis put a lot of handwork on this negative, accentuating the existing lines that are already there with greater contrast. Philosophically, we may like or dislike the treatment done here in the darkroom. I personally like seeing this unique beauty of this process. And the thing about this particular photo is, at the time, he was a prisoner of war. His life ended as a prisoner of war in Oklahoma. He longed to return to his Arizona homeland, and he was without shackles. He was without a fortified cell. He was a prisoner of war with a gentleman's promise, and here he is. In contrast to a couple of other portraits of Geronimo that are floating around out there, in which in both of those instances he's armed, here we see an old, frail man with just a few more years on his life. And yet, when this man travels, he will sell the buttons off of his coat or shirt as souvenirs. In fact, those buttons were probably only there for a few minutes, and in a few minutes later, they were going to be replaced for the next souvenirs he was going to sell. And Canyon de Chelly. That's the caption on this particular photogravure, therefore we know where it's at. Therefore, we see these magnificent canyon walls rising as if they are a protective sentinel, and yet here we have the figures at the far bottom, and it kind of gives you an extra sense of humanity. It really shrinks us down to where we really stand. And then one final one here to look at, and this is just going to be a pure example of a couple of different things that I want to say in terms of looking at something live in person at an art museum, and I don't want to spoil it here. I'll flash you here up on the screen, and it is the first plate that is entitled The Vanishing Race. And if you know anything about Edward Curtis, you know about this picture. Let me start with the good here. I think this is just the absolute perfect example of what an artist envisions in terms of pre-visualization, in terms of making that statement and essence. And this does it, except it is just not technically executed. Something that I just learned today is that they almost threw out the plate for this image because it just didn't work in the studio. They could not make it work, but they still chose it as a photogravure for this 20-volume set, and it's become a bit of an icon, I suppose. The reason they did not throw away the plate, and again, this is just pure and simple, the reason you come to the museum to look at the pictures on the wall and not online on your computer monitor is, I can tell you right now, what you are seeing on the screen here is not the same as being live in person and seeing the original photogravure here and the gold tone here. This is just absolutely stunning. Okay, so I like the picture a little bit better. It is still ultimately a great example of the vision of an artist. So it may not necessarily matter exactly what pictorialism means in the context of all of art, whether we are appreciating from the next room a Cézanne or a Picasso, but it does matter here in this particular gallery of all of these wonderful photogravures of Edward Curtis. Edward Curtis sharpened his teeth and honed his craft into a beautiful art during the height and peak of what is regarded as the pictorial movement, as we define it as a number of artists and painters taking up photography and really working hard to present their photography work as art with a capital A. Appreciating art does take a certain objective degree of understanding art. Now, that's not the same thing as appreciating beauty, but it's okay, perfectly acceptable to come in and soak in this collection live in person, face to face, look at the prints hanging on the walls and let the beauty speak to you. There's one more thing that I want to conclude with here. One more quote from a pictorialist during the pictorialism era, and it is from Henry Peach Robinson. And he said this around 1860. He said 9 out of 10 photographers are, unfortunately, quite ignorant of art. And I would also like to add one more, and that is, I'm going to repeat the Alfred Stieglitz quote, which is, originality, hand in hand with simplicity, are the two qualities which we Americans need in order to produce artistic pictures. These qualities can only be attained through cultivation and conscientious study of art. Simple. That's how that's done. I am John Jacobson with Picture Michigan. Remember, always keep pulling that trigger. What I want to first demonstrate for you here is I want to lean up against this pole here so I look extra introspective, hopefully giving me a little bit of extra authority on the subject in case prove the definition of pictorialism in photography is more about a branch of photography than a style of photography, and that the pictorialism movement was about the presentation and acceptance of photography as art with a capital A versus the blurry, fuzzy thing. Sure, photographers back then did do blurry, fuzzy, out of focus, manipulated, etc., but most of them were simply applying what we learned in art school about arrangement of items and shapes and lines and tones and chiaroscuro around the picture space. That's what pictorial photography was really all about back at the birth of photography. I just want to preach. Let's call it quits.